Good morning, everyone. This is John Shaw, the director of the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute at Southern Illinois University in Carbondale. Thanks so much for joining us for another installment of our series, Understanding Our New World. And today we're really delighted to be joined by one of the best biographers in the country, Kai Bird, who is also the executive director of the Leon Levy Center for Biography at the City University of New York. Let me tell you a little bit about Kai. He grew up in a foreign service family, traveled widely, earned an undergraduate degree at Carleton, a graduate degree at Northwestern University, had a terrific career as a journalist, then shifted to biography and has just done some remarkable work. He's the author of 7 books, 5 of which are biographies. One that I'm sure you are familiar with came out some years ago. It's called American Prometheus: The Triumph and Tragedy of J. Robert Oppenheimer, which won the Pulitzer Prize in 2006 and became the basis of the film Oppenheimer that came out several years ago to such great acclaim. We're going to spend Kai's most recent book is called The Outlier, and this is the book about Jimmy Carter. And came out several years ago and got rave reviews, and is a really intriguing portrait of President Carter, which I think is particularly interesting and relevant now as we celebrate President Carter's 100th birthday. So, Kai, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me, John. It's a pleasure.
Kai, you have called yourself an accidental biographer. And I know you began as a journalist. You were a writer for The Nation for a number of years. Talk about your sort of transition from newsman and journalist to biographer. How did that happen?
Well, I'd been working as a young man in my 20s for about 10 years as a reporter overseas, but also with The Nation magazine later in New York. And after about 10 years, I sort of had the thought, well, it's time to try to write a book. And I tackled, just by accident, I was interested in, this was 1981, I was interested in the Middle East, where I'd grown up, part of my childhood, and in the making of foreign policy. And so I came up with the idea of studying the intersection between big oil companies and their influence on US foreign policy. And as I got into the research, I stumbled across the name John J. McCloy, who was a powerful Wall Street lawyer who represented all 22 American oil companies. And I looked him up in Who's Who and was just blown away by how, he was everywhere. He had his fingers in everything. And I decided, well, this is the vehicle to do what I'm interested in and much else. And I wrote a proposal, got a contract, and I thought it was going to take me 2.5 years. 10 years later, biography takes a long time. And I got sucked into the archives, and yes, I became an accidental biographer. By the end of the 10 years, I was really no longer a working journalist, and I was in love with the art and craft of biography. And so I did yet another biography, and continued down that long and winding road.
Well, Kai, in an interview, you said, quote, "I think it's the best form of history. It's the most probing and intimate, precisely because it's about one person. And yet through the biography of this one person, you have a window into all sorts of history that you'll learn along the way. So it's the most accessible form of history. It's very captivating to the average reader." Talk about just the kind of immersion that you do when you're writing a biography into the life of a person. I mean, having tried it a bit myself, I mean, it becomes, and I think you've used this word too, an obsession where, you bore your friends and your spouse and everyone with, what little tidbits you found that day. I mean, talk about just kind of the obsessive quality of biography?
Yeah, well, it's all in the details. And, of course, I wouldn't pretend to claim that I can tell the whole story or even the truth about another human being's life. It's too complicated. But you do get sucked into the details, and it's the little things that propel the story and the narrative along, and uh, everything from the private life to the public triumphs and tragedies. And along the way, if you've done your job well, you have a page turner, because it is about one person's life, and we're all curious about how we each make our way through life in this complicated world. And along the way, you sort of learn a lot of history that you wouldn't otherwise sit down to read, because it's it's just not accessible in a straight history format. But if you're using the vehicle of a biography, uh, it it can become a page turner.
Well, Kai, one thing that I've been struck by in some of the interviews you've done about the craft of biography is the balance between just being meticulous and thorough and just mastering the archive, and then also the practical need about when to stop. And I know you've used the term, biography's disease, about being just so deeply pulled into an archive or research project that you had never emerge. And I was struck by something. Robert Caro, of course, who's so well known in this field, has said kind of famously, "Turn every page." And yet, in a talk I saw you give, you said, in the real world, you can't turn every page. You refer to the Carter archive that has, more than 2 million documents. So if you're going to do it in the finite time we have on this earth, you have to sort of make strategic decisions about, when you stop turning the pages, or frankly, which pages to turn. Talk about that if you would, please.
Yes, well, exactly. You can't possibly turn every page if there are 2 million pages, like in the Carter Presidential Library, or 8 million in the Reagan Library. And there are, millions of pages in the LBJ library as well. But, I respect Robert Caro's ambition to turn every page, but the reality is that even Caro has to make choices. And those choices are governed by subjective biases and interests. When I sit down to write a biography of Jimmy Carter, it's my take, my story on what I think is important about Jimmy Carter and what interests me about Carter. Um, just by way of example, it turns out when I started working on Jimmy in 2015, I suddenly realized a few months later that a colleague and acquaintance of mine, Jonathan Alter, had also signed a contract to do Jimmy Carter. And we run into each other once in a while here in New York or elsewhere. And Jonathan was, I think, quite worried about the competition. And I assured him, that his book was going to be very different than mine, just because he was John and I'm Kai, and I have a different take. So indeed, if you look at these two books, it's quite interesting. They're both full-blown biographies. They both cover the childhood, but the presidency. My book, I spend relatively few pages, for instance, talking about Carter's normalization of relations with China. Alter spends a whole chapter on that because he was fascinated by that. He spent more time on the childhood. I spent more time on the White House. I spent a lot of time quoting and analyzing the influence of Carter's national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, on his presidency, and criticizing Brzezinski's influence. If you look at Jonathan Alter's book, he hardly deals with Brzezinski at all. So, this is why we need multiple biographies about presidents or important figures. You need the different perspectives.
I'm going to come back to Carter in a second. One thing I've been struck in as I look at the kind of the body of work you did is that you are doing is that you don't always go to the super big names. I mean, Carter obviously is a former president, so he would maybe be the exception, but several of the people you've done are relatively obscure, although, people who study, post in the Cold War era would be familiar with them. And we had an event a couple weeks ago with Sam Friedman, who you might know from a great nonfiction writer at Columbia Journalism School. And one of the things Sam said, he was talking about just the topics that he's taken on. He said, he said, I insist on playing the music inside my head, no matter what the marketplace says. As you sought out topics, have you kind of consciously steered clear of the sort of, familiar turf? Or is it, I mean, how have your subjects been sort of decided in your mind?
Well, years ago when I started out, I was interested in sort of the theme of how power works in America, in this complicated democracy. And I had the notion that if you look at the sort of the fixers and the consultants and the men sort of and women behind the scenes, that would give you a window into that world that you wouldn't otherwise see if you focus simply on a president. So I was interested in McGeorge Bundy, and perhaps most Americans today are not familiar with that name, but McGeorge Bundy was a major architect of the war in Vietnam. He was national security advisor to Kennedy and Johnson. And before that, he'd been dean of Harvard. He had played all sorts of behind the scenes roles. Later in life, he became president of the Ford Foundation. And so through his life, you can actually explore a lot of really interesting issues, public policy issues, but most specifically the issue that was of front and center when I was a young man coming out of college, the war in Vietnam. How did we get into that war, and how did we sort of stumble into it, and why did we persist in such folly and such a tragedy? Well, McGeorge Bundy is a window into those questions. And he is a liberal, and liberals prosecuted this war. So it was a way to figure out what had happened. Likewise, much later on, I ended up, after writing about Robert Oppenheimer, I was curious about trying to figure out what had happened in my childhood in the Middle East amidst all these wars. And I had grown up in Beirut and Jerusalem and Cairo and Saudi Arabia, and went through the 1956 war, the 67 war, the hijackings of 1970, Black September, the Civil War in Jordan. And I was too young, to understand the complexity of all these events. And so I took the opportunity to go back and explore those events through the vehicle of a childhood memoir. And likewise, again, to extend my interest in the Middle East, I then later on chose to do a biography of a completely unknown, obscure CIA officer named Robert Ames, who I had known as a child growing up in Saudi Arabia. I didn't know he was a CIA clandestine officer, but he died in the first truck bomb attack on a U.S. embassy in Beirut in April 1983. And I became obsessed with telling his story and trying to figure out why he died in that terrorist attack, and who was behind it, and what he had done before with his life as a CIA operative in the Middle East. And again, it his life in particular is rather, he's not well known, but if you read this book, it's an eye-opener into the politics and the foreign policy and the relationship between America and this Arab-Israeli conflict.
Guy, I want to talk for a minute about Oppenheimer book because it is one of the most interesting collaborations I've ever heard of. And just in brief, your co-author, Mr. Sherwin, Marty Sherwin, had begun this book in I think 1980, had amassed 50,000 documents, transcripts, et cetera. I mean, it just is apparently very meticulously organized and chronicled, but had just hit a point where he simply could not write and brought you in, I think it was 1999, and pick up the story from there. I mean, it's just a remarkable way of how you two kind of came together and pulled out a stalled project into a Pulitzer Prize winning, sensation, really.
Yeah, no, Marty and I had become friends over in the sort of late 80s and 90s. He was a Tufts University history professor, a brilliant historian of the Cold War. But he had signed this contract in 1980 to do Oppenheimer, and he just became mesmerized by Oppenheimer's personality, the enigma of Oppenheimer, and he went to every archive in the world related to the subject. He spent, hundreds of hours in the Library of Congress where Poppy's papers are cataloged. He interviewed over 150 people, from relatives to students at Berkeley to fellow physicists, but he sort of caught what I call biographer's disease, and he just couldn't start writing because he was intimidated by the subject and knew that there was always one more archive, one more interview to do. But he finally came to me in 1999, and I was in between books. I was unemployed. I was not quite sure what to tackle next, and he suggested that I join him on his project, and I told him no. I told him no. I like you too much, Marty. And I said that because, collaboration, particularly between biographers, is fraught with peril. You become, even if you're easygoing, you become obsessed with the subject, and we all have egos, and it's hard to collaborate on a biography in general. It's a solo enterprise. And I knew this was Marty's topic for 20 years. He had worked on it. Anyway, Marty didn't take no for an answer, and he kept coming back to me. And he was a funny guy. He's no longer with us, alas. He died in October 21 at the age of 84. But he at one point he turned to me and he says, Kai, if you don't join me on this project, my gravestone is going to read, he took it with him. And that made me laugh. And anyway, I joined him, and it turned into a fabulous collaboration. Marty knew the materials so well. I started to write. Once I started to write on the childhood, he began to jump in, and he would know what was missing in my first drafts. And his material that he had spent 20 years just meticulously accumulating FBI documents. It was just fabulous. So I did a couple of interviews, and that was about it, and focused on the writing. And it still took us almost 5 years to get the book out. But it was very rewarding and exciting to work with Marty, and I'm just very saddened that he's no longer with us and wasn't around to see Oppenheimer come out last summer, and to enjoy seeing our words transformed to the big screen.
And as I understand it, your book was effectively the Bible for the actors and the director and producer. I mean, this was they did a deep dive into your book to shape the film.
I was told it was required reading on the set. So yeah, and Christopher Nolan, he just, this all happened just by happenstance. Nolan happened to be given the book by one of his producers and said, "I think you might be interested in this biography of Oppenheimer called American Prometheus." And he sat down and read it in March of 21. And 5 months later, he had a full first draft of the script, a very long script. And only then did he call us up and say, I'm interested in picking up the film option, and I've got a script, and can we have a meeting? And it all went very fast after that. The script is wholly based on the book. Whole paragraphs come straight out of the book in terms of some of the dialogue and scenes. And it's it's a Hollywood miracle, I call it, because it is a film that is really long, 3 hours, and complicated, but it is accurate to the history and I think to the portrayal of the man Oppenheimer. And that's all due to Christopher Nolan's brilliance as a scriptwriter and someone who can think visually on the big screen.
Well, let's talk about another complicated man, a little different than Oppenheimer, Jimmy Carter. And I want to read a couple of things that you've said about Carter. This was actually in an essay in the New York Times, but this might be a good kind of lead into our discussion of Carter. But you in your New York Times essay, you say the man was not what you think. He was tough. He was extremely intimidating. Jimmy Carter was probably the most intelligent, hardworking, and decent man to have occupied the Oval Office in the 20th century. Mr. Carter remains the most misunderstood president of the last century. And then you go on to say his presidency is remembered simplistically as a failure, yet it was far more consequential than most recall. Let's just play on just who Jimmy Carter is and was. And I should add, in the course of your work on this book, you had interviews with Carter, and let's just play with this. You said you found him a difficult person to interview. Pick up on that.
Yeah, people have this perception that Jimmy Carter is a sort of woolly-headed liberal humanist and a nice guy. Actually, he's really tough and sharp and easily bored. And so as the biographer, he was, gracious enough to give me time, but our interviews were usually exactly 50 minutes. He'd be looking at his watch, as it wound down. And he was easily bored with questions. So I had to, make his answers were short. And he wasn't terribly interested in reminiscing about his presidency from 40 years ago. He was focused on his day job. Even in his early 90s, when I was interviewing him, he was focused on the Carter Center and bringing peace to the Syrian civil war, or monitoring elections around the world, or trying to wipe out guinea worm disease. He's an extremely driven man. I saw him one morning at 7 a.m. conduct a meeting at the Carter Center in front of scores of Carter Center people. And he got up on the stage and walked back and forth for 45 minutes expounding about guinea worm disease and other aspects of the Carter Center project. He's focused on his work, and it's the same as when he was in the White House. When he would get up at 5:30 in the morning. He kept farmers' hours, even in the White House. And by 6 or 6:30, he was in the Oval Office, and he was reading 300 pages of memos every day. Anyway, in my very first interview, I was stumbling trying to get him to talk. And fortunately, I thought of asking him about his old friend and lawyer, Charlie Curbo, who had been the lawyer that he went to in 1962 when he first ran for Georgia state senator. And it was a very close election, and literally a ballot box was stolen and stuffed. And Carter suspected which county this had happened in, and he hired Curbo to defend him. And Curbo was instrumental. You know, Curbo was, again, a guy sort of completely unknown to this day, even unknown during the Carter White House years. He wasn't well known. He didn't take a job in the White House, but he was Carter's most personal, closest advisor from 1962 until he died in the 90s. And I knew that I told Jimmy in that first interview, you know, Mr. President, I can't find any of the letters and memos that Curbo sent you over the years. And only then did Jimmy Carter's bright blue eyes light up, and he sort of suddenly took interest in the interview. He says, well, that's odd, because he was very important. And he turned to his aide and said, you know, we got to find those papers. 3 days later, I get a phone call, and Jimmy Carter has found 5 boxes, 5 big cardboard boxes of Charlie Curbo's papers in the attic of Curbo's widow. And 6 months later, I was allowed to be the first person to sit down and read those memos, first person since Carter had received them himself. So, and they were fabulous. They created the backbone of much of my narrative. And you know, that's what biography is all about. It actually comes down to a great treasure hunt. Occasionally you find the treasure, often in an attic.
That's it. Well, let's talk. Okay, I mean, the kind of the range of Carter's accomplishments on the foreign policy front, and you know, you write it you describe them very clearly in your terrific book. But you know, we forget, you know, he played the leading role in normalizing relations with China. You know, the Middle East peace, Camp David, of course, the Panama Canal Treaty, and an area that you talk about a lot, and really in a kind of a profound way, is Carter's advocacy of human rights. And you believe that, you know, as much as people talk about, you know, the Reagan defense buildup as the force that, you know, led to the end of the Cold War, you think that Carter's push on human rights may have played an even more important role in the dismantling of the Soviet Empire. So talk about just the foreign policy realm broadly, and that particularly his importance on human rights and kind of in terms of transforming American foreign policy.
Right. Well, absolutely. It's a myth that the Cold War ended because of Ronald Reagan's threat about Star Wars or his defense buildup. You know, the Cold War ended because of Gorbachev, and it ended in the years leading up to the rise of Gorbachev. The Soviet Empire was weakened precisely by the emphasis that Jimmy Carter put on human rights. It was very embarrassing for the Russian people to hear the president of the United States talk about simple things like human rights, the right to free speech, the right to food and clothing, and justice in the law courts. And this is what prompted, you know, the the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia. It's what spawned the early labor union movement, Solidarity, in Poland, which weakened the Soviet Empire in Eastern Europe and led to the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the rise of Gorbachev. So you know, Jimmy Carter should get the credit for this, not Ronald Reagan. And similarly, Carter's accomplishments in his 4 years in office, it's an amazing record. He passed the Panama Canal Treaty. He negotiated SALT II, the Arms Control Treaty. He did China normalization. He had immigration reform. He did human rights. He did Camp David, bringing a peace treaty between Egypt and Israel that is still in place. He attempted to solve, and he thought he had gotten an agreement on moves toward, steps towards Palestinian autonomy in the West Bank. And alas, Menachem Begin and Israel sort of reneged on that part of the negotiations. But it's an incredible 4 years. And it's astonishing that many of the issues that he was dealing with, energy, race, religion, climate change, healthcare, are the same issues that are front and center in this very elections campaign season today in the year 2024. And so Carter's presidency was extremely prescient, and he was a sort of prophet in the wilderness. I argue he was a president who was ahead of his times, very far-reaching in his thinking. I argue that he, not only, as most people recognize, that he was a decent man, uncorruptible. There was no scandal in his presidency or personal life, but he was also extremely consequential.
There's a couple elements that I think are really important to Carter's ultimate political defeat. Obviously, the economy of the 1970s was a treacherous thing. It was throughout the globe with high interest rates, high inflation, slow growth, stagflation, it was called then. So, I mean, Carter had a horrific battle with that. He obviously, in the end, appointed Mr. Volcker to the Fed, and probably he did more to shatter inflation than anything else that could happen. So, talk a little bit about the economic piece and how that was so difficult for Carter, and of course, also the Iran hostage crisis, which 440-day crisis, and lots of people think that Carter probably misread you know, the importance of just placing it so central to his presidency that he was in some sense a hostage himself. So play on those two elements that undermined his political fortunes.
Yeah, in the late 70s, Carter just came into the White House and was dealt a bad hand. He had a lot of bad luck. The economy was going through inflation that was extraordinary, even higher than what we've just gone through in the last years in the wake of the pandemic. And it was all driven by oil prices largely, and also the remnants of the after effects of financing the Vietnam War from deficits. And Carter he came from South Georgia. He was a populist, a liberal Southern populist, but he had sort of small town fiscal conservative instincts, and he was really concerned about inflation and government deficits, which were actually pretty small at the time compared to what we've gone through in the last few decades. Anyway, he made us. He was determined, having one power in this most improbable election in 1976, coming from nowhere, the peanut farmer unknown from South Georgia, having one power. His Southern Baptist morality compelled him to constantly tell himself, I have to do the right thing. I have to study what is the right thing, how to solve these problems. And so he made a series of really tough decisions in his presidency on domestic issues and on foreign policy that were very politically costly. His wife, Rosie, was constantly telling him, Jimmy, why don't you put off some of these tough things? Like the Panama Canal Treaty is a no no winner politically. It's very unpopular, but Carter said, no, we have to do it, otherwise we're gonna get stuck in a civil disturbance, or that may spill over into guerrilla warfare in the Panama Canal area. So he pushed through the treaty. Likewise, Camp David. So it's interesting. In 1976, Jimmy Carter came out of nowhere. He won like 75% of the Jewish vote, 90% of the African American vote, a plurality of white working class voters. He won a 70% of the evangelical vote because, of course, he was a Southern Baptist and born again. He, won the South. And 4 years later, he won only 45% of the Jewish vote. Extraordinary for a Democrat, a sitting incumbent Democratic president, to lose the Jewish vote. He lost the evangelical vote. He lost white working class union members. He lost the South. And why? Because he had taken tough decisions that were actually the right thing to do, but were politically costly and alienating these particular constituencies. And so, it's a sort of Shakespearean tragedy for Carter personally. And yet again, as I've said, I think in retrospect, historians are realizing he was quite prescient. He lost the evangelical vote, which was a shock to him because, this is a man who takes his religion, even to this day, very seriously. But he lost it because he insisted that all these white evangelical private academies that were popping up all over the South in response to the fact that public schools in the South were being forced to integrate. And in response, white Christian evangelicals were building their own private network of evangelical white school academies, that they wanted to continue to have tax exempt status as a religious institution. He says, no, you can't do that. So he did the right thing, but completely alienated his own constituency by doing so. It's a fascinating morality tale.
Well, kind of one, I taught a class last year in which I had my students read Carter's so-called Malay speech. Of course, he never used that
Oh, that's
term. Um,
fascinating speech.
well, and the thing is, my students were just stunned that an American president could speak simple truth to the American people in that way. I mean, all of them were just kind of blown away by just the candor and so forth. And so, but to me, that includes, I mean, it shows both Carter at his most kind of respectful of the American people and honest and truthful, but also kind of least politically adept. I mean, as I was, many people suggest that would have been a terrific farewell address as he's leaving.
Right.
It would have been up there with Eisenhower's, farewell address. But to deliver it, in the summer of '79, when the inflation is roaring and he's moving towards an election year, seemed like an ill-advised time to deliver the address. Talk about that speech, if you would, please.
Well, it was very ill-timed. It's called the Malay speech, even though he didn't actually use that word. But he was talking about the spiritual state of the country. And it was almost like, a Southern Baptist sermon. He was telling the American people, you shouldn't believe that you can attain happiness in material wealth. He was railing against materialism and the country's focus on consumer ambitions. And he was urging that we focus on community rather than the individual. Well, this is like his Republican opponents, and Ronald Reagan in particular, picked up on this speech and just said, this is un-American what he's talking about. America is about individual rights. America is about material gain and competition in the marketplace and the success of private enterprise. And here Carter is preaching from the Oval Office, trying to encourage the American people to focus on community. In fact, in American history, in going back, there is this constant tension between the private and the community. And Carter, is a Southern Baptist who takes his Christianity seriously, and specifically that branch of sort of the evangelical movement that focuses on community. And well, anyway, it was not a politically smart speech to make in the summer of '79 when the American people are complaining about skyrocketing gasoline prices and long lines at the gas stations and the Iranian Revolution. And so things seem to be out of control. And here's the president talking about community and don't focus on material acquisition and narcissistic obsessions. And so it didn't go over well. But again, I would argue it's a remarkable speech, and can be read so by young people today, and it's relevant.
Hi, well, your book has some wonderful analysis of Carter's relationship with Ted Kennedy, and it's talk about Shakespeare. I mean, it seems like both of them brought the worst out in each other. I mean, they're both two really honorable human beings, but they didn't like each other. They saw each other as rivals, and they became almost so consumed with disagreeing with each other that they kind of blocked, initiatives that both of them wanted in terms of like healthcare reform.
Right.
And of course, Kennedy's challenge of Carter in 1980, complicated seriously Carter's reelection, maybe paved the way for Reagan. Talk a little bit about Carter Kennedy and just how you read that dynamic.
Well, it was a clash of cultures. These two very decent politicians and human beings, really, in many ways, just came from different worlds. Kennedy from his Boston Brahmin elite aristocratic background, and Jimmy Carter from the red clay of South Georgia and farming and Southern Baptists. They spoke a different language, and it was oil and water. They just didn't. Carter first met Kennedy in 1974 when he came down to attend what's called the Law Day speeches in Georgia, and to talk about the role of law and justice in the American judicial system. And actually, Hunter Thompson, the famous Rolling Stone journalist, happened to be in attendance. And it was the first time he had met Carter. And he saw Carter throw away his prepared remarks after listening to Kennedy. And he gave an impromptu, really sort of Southern populist harangue against corrupt judges who railroad poor people in the judicial system. He was, railing against Southern justice in a very liberal populist manner. And it was a terrific speech. It was just, but all extemporaneous. And Hunter Thompson was just blown away by it and went off and wrote this famous essay in Rolling Stone talking about the encounter between Carter and Kennedy. And it was the beginning of their rivalry. And you're right. It's tragically, it ended up in Carter's White House years. You know, they both men had campaigned in 70, or both men in 76 had supported the notion of national health insurance, a national, comprehensive national health care system. And Kennedy had introduced a bill, which is essentially a single payer uh, healthcare system that he advocated. And Carter had, in the campaign, supported it in principle. But once he was in office, his sort of Southern small town fiscal conservatism kicked in, and he looked at the bill and the cost, and he looked at the votes in the Senate, and he said, we're never going to get this passed, and it's too expensive. And so he had Kennedy into the Oval Office, and they argued about it. And Carter just said, you know, your bill doesn't have a political chance of passage, and it's too expensive. So I'm going to introduce a national catastrophic health care bill, which would provide every citizen with catastrophic health insurance so that no citizen would pay in more than $5,000 in a year for a major health care incident. And it would be much cheaper. And Carter thought that with Kennedy's support, he would be able to pass this in 1978, 79. And it would have been a huge foot in the door to a comprehensive national health care system, which we're still grappling, trying to create. You know, Obamacare has been a big step forward, but it's still not what Ted Kennedy wanted in 1978. Anyway, they could not agree. They could not, you know, Kennedy refused to compromise, Carter refused to compromise, and the result was a stalemate, and Carter didn't get even the catastrophic health care bill that he wanted passed, and Kennedy couldn't get his passed. And so the whole goal of giving the American people and addressing this national health care system was delayed and postponed for 3 decades until Obama came along. And we're still we're still debating it. It's still a major campaign issue with the Trumpists. And anyway, I that's one of the points in my biography, The Outlier of Jimmy Carter, where I just, you know, it's wrenching to see how close they could have come, and it all fell apart.
Hi, one thing that I have thought about over the years is the what I call the James Baker counterfactual, which is what if someone like a James Baker had been Carter's chief of staff? Someone who was, you know, shrewd, smart, strategic, understood how Washington worked, and, you know, probably would have dramatically truncated Carter's agenda, would have, you know, sequenced issues far more strategically and kind of a politically adept way. I mean, is that? I mean, is that something? And I guess that goes to the point of just how Carter managed his presidency. I mean, you mentioned earlier, you know, reading 250, 300 pages a day of policy memos. I mean, it's a fair question to ask: should the president of the United States be spending that much time getting immersed in detail and not, you know, making, you know, sort of broader appeals to the public and bringing people in? So,
Right.
so play off that.
Yeah, that's a great question and a great what if. Um, Oddly enough, Carter came in and he decided not to have a chief of staff at all. And he said, I'll just have everybody reporting directly to me from health or defense department or education. And of course, he was a man of immense energy, and his ability to pay attention to details and read all these memos and to work 12 hours a day. You know, theoretically, this is something that should be respected and admired, and we would like to have in a presidency. I don't think Donald Trump ever worked 12 hours in a day in the Oval Office, but Jimmy Carter did every day. And and it was too much. He attempted to do too much. And there, some people in the Carter inner circles, in retrospect, thought that if he had brought in Charlie Curbo, his lawyer friend, Curbo could have served in that function and served as chief of staff and as a gatekeeper. And that was the only person that Carter would consider appointing as chief of staff in 1977. But Curbo refused to take any position in Washington. And so, yeah, it is a what if. On the other hand, I argue in the Outlier that it's also, people forget both how much Carter accomplished, but they also forget actually how close that 1980 election was.
Right.
He was a brilliant campaigner. He was ruthless in using the hostage crisis, for instance, to gain sympathy. And yet, in the last 2 weeks, it all fell apart and he lost decisively. But up until 2 weeks before the November election, he was within the margin of errors in most of the polls, and he thought he could come from behind. And he also thought that he was really close to solving the hostage crisis through diplomacy, through negotiations, and he was. And yet there's something called the October surprise that happened. And I devote a whole chapter in my book to the so-called October surprise that was a successful effort by Ronald Reagan's campaign manager, William Casey, who was later appointed CIA chief by Reagan. But Casey, in the summer of 1980, in the midst of the campaign, secretly flew off to Madrid, Spain, and had behind closed door negotiations with a representative of the Ayatollah Khomeini. And he was outrageously telling the Iranians, don't make a deal with Jimmy Carter. You should wait and deal with my guy. He's going to become the president and he'll give you a better deal. Well, this is an outrageous, treasonous act, undermining diplomacy, prolonging the hostage crisis, prolonging the imprisonment of all these American diplomats. And it was also the beginning, I argue, of the Iran-Contra scandal that occurred in the Reagan administration and in his second term, because it was the beginning of this secret backdoor relationship that Bill Casey had opened up in 1980 that grew into sort of arms for hostages a few years later. It's a fascinating story, and again, another big sort of what if.
All right, let's talk just for a minute about Carter's former post-presidency life. And maybe a perfect way to tee it up is, you described this wonderfully. Carter gave a eulogy at Gerald Ford's funeral and pointed out a New Yorker cartoon in which a young boy is talking to his father and says, "Daddy, when I grow up, I want to be a former president." And Carter had such a remarkable post-presidency. The Carter Center, of course, has been central to it, and just the remarkable work he's done on conflict resolution, global health, election monitoring. Talk about Carter's sort of second life as a former president.
Well, he was actually thrown into a deep depression when he lost to that former movie actor, Ronald Reagan. He couldn't believe it. And he was quite, this is part of Jimmy Carter's sort of strong ego and his arrogance. He thought he was going to pull that out in 1980 and beat Reagan. And he was rather devastated that he had lost. And he felt he had so much more to do. to accomplish in a second term. But he moved back to Plains to the house that he's lived in all these decades since 1960, with the exception of the 4 years in the Oval and in the White House. And one evening in 1981, he woke up in the middle of the night, and his wife Rosie said, "Jimmy, what's going on? You never wake up." And he says, "I've suddenly figured out what I want to do with the rest of my life." And he explained instead of having a sort of traditional presidential library and museum to celebrate his political career, he was going to have a foundation that would do good works. Yeah, and this is the origins of the Carter Center. And it's really, in retrospect, it's an extension of his presidency. Everything that the Carter Center has done the last 40 years has been an extension of the same work that Carter did on human rights around the world, on healthcare, and he's not been the kind of ex-president who, like others, went off and gave $1 million speeches. He still lives. He's still under hospice care at the age of 100, living in that same relatively small house in Plains, Georgia. He never profited off of his presidency. He just spent the rest of his ex-presidency doing good works. And it's quite an admirable record. And no ex-president since has been able to match it. So
Hi, as we wind down, tell us a little bit about the Levy Center that you are the executive director of. I believe it was started in 2007. You've been there since 2017. Tell us a little bit about what you're doing there at the center.
Well, it's a great institution and unique in that there's nothing else like it in the country or in the world, where we're devoted specifically and only to supporting the work of hardworking biographers. Most biographies take at least 5 years, sometimes much longer. American Prometheus took 25 years. It's an expensive form of scholarship. And so we at the Leon Levy Center, we award fellowships, 5 fellowships every year, $72,000 a piece to 5 biographers. It's very competitive. We get over 130 applicants every year for the 5 positions. So it's quite competitive. And they get a chance to spend a year focused completely on their biography. And we meet once a month and circulate sample chapters in progress and gently critique them. And in addition, we have a series of public events, around 12 to 15 a year, in which I or someone else gets on stage with a biographer to talk about their new book and explore the life that they've spent years exploring. And in general, it's we're also, our sort of larger mission is to persuade. We're trying to infiltrate the academy and to persuade universities that biography is something that a form of scholarship that should be taken seriously, that it's a form of scholarship that is accessible to ordinary readers, and it's a vehicle that teaches civics and history and politics, and also literature. A lot of our biography fellows are writing about literary figures, so it's biography is of great appeal to both history and English departments in universities around the country, and we want universities to pay attention to this rigorous and difficult form of scholarship.
And I believe the City University even offers a master's degree in biography and memoir writing. Is that right?
That's correct. About 4 years ago, I wrote a proposal to form inaugurate a 2-year master's program in biography and memoir. And actually, I encountered a lot of skepticism from the university bureaucracy. They said, "Oh, how many students are going to sign up for this? Is this really practical?" Well, today we have more than 60 students enrolled in this master's program. A lot of them are interested in doing family memoirs, but that's a popular and legitimate genre, and a lot of them are being taught how to do the difficult sort of art and craft of biography as well.
Great. Just a final quick question is for the students who might be listening to our conversation, what kind of advice would you give them as they launch careers in journalism, history, writing? I mean, what sort of advice do you wish you had been given when you were 21, 22 years old when you were leaving Carleton about how to launch a career that would be interesting and rewarding?
Well, obviously, I would urge everyone to read more biographies. Um, but if you're interested in having a life as a public intellectual, you need to learn to write, but you need to learn to write for the whole country. And I don't mean to dumb down your audience, but you need to aim to engage in public discourse and to reach the average reader. Most American citizens are capable of picking up a book and reading it and learning the public policy issues behind any particular subject. But they need to be engaged in narrative writing. And so write every day and read biography every day.
Sounds like a good way to live, if you ask me.
Okay.
Kai, thank you so much for a terrific conversation. And I would commend to all of our listeners to read Kai's terrific book, The Outlier on Jimmy Carter. It's really an important insight. And also his other work. I have about 3 or 4 of his books at home, and he is just this terrifically substantive and also accessible writer that really makes you appreciate the art and craft of biography. So, Kai, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, John. This has been a lively and interesting conversation.
I agree. Thank you so much. And thanks to all you for watching another edition of our series. We will have this video on our website. Please show it to family and friends. Thank you for supporting the Institute and keeping the memory of Paul Simon alive and well. Thank you so much.